Appendix 1 of the Religious Experience of the Roman People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Religious Experience of the Roman People by W. Warde FOWLER. On the use of huts or booths in religious ritual. This may be taken as an addendum to Lecture 2 on Taboo at Rome, but owing to the uncertainty of the explanation given in it, I reserved it for an appendix. The custom here dealt with is found both in the public and private worship of the Romans, and also in Greece and elsewhere, but has never, so far as I know, been investigated by anthropologists. On the Ides of March, at the festival of Anna Peregrina, a deity explained as representing the ring of the year, whose cult is not recognized in the ancient religious calendar, the lower population came out of the city and lay about all day in the Campus Martius near the Tiber. Ovid, fortunately, took the trouble to describe the scene in the third book of his Fasti, as he had witnessed it himself. Some of them, he says, lay in the open, some constructed tents, and some made rude huts of stakes and branches, stretching their togas over them to make a shelter. Plebs venit ac virdes, passim desiecta per herbas, potat et accumbit cum pare quisque sua. Sub Iove pars durat pauci tentoria ponunt. Sunt hibus e ramis fondia facta casa est. Pars ubi pro rigidis calamos statuare columnis. De super extantas imposuere tocas. Quot sumant saiatos ad numerumque bibunt. It appears from Ovid's account that there was much drunkenness and obscene language. This was in fact a festa very different in character from those of the Numan calendar, and that there was a magical element in the cult of the deity seems proved by the mysterious allusion to Virginius Cruer in connection with her grove not far from the scene of revelry in Martial 4:64-17, C.P. Pliny, N.H. 28:78, and Columella 10:558. Tibullus describes something of the same kind at a rustic festival, though he does not make it clear what time of year he is speaking of. A few lines before he had mentioned the drinking and leaping over the fire at Parilia, the shepherd's festival in April, though I cannot feel sure that the following lines are also meant to refer to it. Tunc operata Deo pubes discumbent in herba, arboris antiquae qua levis umbra cadit, aut e veste sua tendent umbracula certis. Vincta coronatus stabit et ipse calix. Here it is too much to suppose that the umbracula were contrived to make up for the want of shade in a country so covered with woodland as Italy was then, and the word certis vincta show that there was some special meaning in the practice. I think we may guess that in both instances the extemporized huts had some forgotten religious meaning. Yet another pass of Tibullus, which also describes a rural festival, alludes to a similar custom. I have given reasons in the Classical Review for thinking that this was a summer festival, accompanied as it was, like many midsummer rites all over Europe, by bonfires and revelry, though the usual interpretation ascribes it to the winter. Tunc nitidus plenis confisus rusticus agris, ingeret ardenti, grandia ligna voco, turbaque venarum faturi bona signa coloni. Ludet et ex verges extruet ante casas. The slaves can here hardly be playing at building houses of twigs like the children in Horace's satire, unless we are to suppose that Tibullus is thinking of slave children only, which is indeed possible. But even if that were so, how are we to account for the popularity of this curious form of sport? There was, however, at Rome a public summer festival included in the calendar, in which we find the same custom. At the Neptunalia on July 23rd, huts or booths were erected made of the foliage of trees. Umbrae vocantur Neptunalibus passae frondei pro tabernaculus, says Festus, following Varius Flaccus, where the last word is one in regular use for military tents. This is the one thing that is told us about this festival, and we may assume that even this would not have come down to us if it had not been a survival rigidly adhered to, i.e., the construction of shelters from the foliage of trees instead of using tents, which could easily have been procured in the city. As the festival was in the hot month of July, we might suppose that shelter from the sun was the real object here, but we do not hear of it at other summer festivals. And the parallel practices I shall now mention make the rationalizing explanation very doubtful. It is unlucky that we know hardly anything about the older and ungrecized Neptunus, and nothing about his festival except this one fact: the comparative method is here our only hope. The Jewish Feast of Tabernacles will, of course, occur at once to everyone. This was in the heat of the summer, and the booths were here, as at the Neptunalia, made of the branches of trees. The explanation given to the Israelites was not that they were thus to shelter themselves from the heat, but to be reminded of their homeless wanderings in the wilderness. Plainly an etymological account, as in the case of the Passover. There are distinct examples in Greece of the same practice, e.g. the xiii days at the Spartan Carnea and tents xiii, in several cases as in the Mysteries of Andania, where the peculiar regulations for the construction of the tents point to a ritualistic origin almost unmistakably. But perhaps the most striking parallel is to be found in the famous letter of Gregory the Great, preserved by Bede, about the British converts to Christianity, who were to be allowed to use their heathen temples as churches. Et quia bove solent in sacrificio daemonum multus occidere debe iis etiam hac in re aliqua solemnitas immutari, ut die dedicationis vel natalici sanctorum martyrum horam ilic reliquiae unitur tabernacula sibi circa eistem acclicias, quae et fanis commutate sunt, de ramis arborum facient, et religiosis conviviis solemnitatem celebrant. Nec diabolo iam animalia emolent, et ad laudam Dei in esu suo animalia occident, etc. Why should Gregory here take the trouble to describe the material out of which these huts were to be made? Surely because the custom was one which had been described to him by Augustine or Mellitus as part of the heathen practice, and one which he was willing to condone as harmless, possibly with a recollection of the Jewish feast, since the Britons set great store by it. If these examples from Europe and Palestine are sufficient to suggest that there was originally a religious or mystic meaning in the custom, we must look for its explanation in anthropological research. Robertson Smith was, I think, the first to suggest a possible explanation of the Feast of Tabernacles by comparing it with the rule stated in Numbers 31:19 that men might not enter their houses after bloodshed. Do ye abide without the camp 7 days. Whosoever hath killed any person, and whosoever hath touched any slain, purify both yourselves and your captives on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. He also pointed out that pilgrims are subject to the same rule, or taboo, in Syria and elsewhere. Since then, an immense mass of evidence has been collected showing that all the world over, persons in a holy or unclean state are placed under this or some similar restriction. And if this be the case with pilgrims and warriors after a battle, it may also have been so with worshippers at some particular festival, even if we are quite unable to recover the special character of the worship which produced the restriction. In the Feast of Tabernacles, which was a harvest festival, the cause seems to have been the great sanctity of the first fruits, which are regarded with extreme veneration in many parts of the world. In the now famous festival of the first fruits among the Natchez Indians of Louisiana, of which the details have been recorded with singular care and obvious accuracy, we find that the chief, the great sun, and all the celebrators have to live in huts 2 miles from their village, while the corn grown for the purpose in a particular spot is sacramentally eaten. It is quite impossible, without further evidence, which is not likely ever to be forthcoming, to explain either the Greek, Roman, or British customs in this way. We must be content with the general principle that the holiness of human beings at particular times is liable to carry with it the practice of renouncing your own dwelling and living in an extemporized hut or booth. The tents that we hear of in the Greek rites I look upon as late developments of this primitive practice. The inscription of Adania, which is the best Greek evidence we possess, dates from only 91 BC, and by that time there would have been every opportunity for the rude huts to become civilized tents. The xiii made by the Vernet in Tibullus' poem were, I would suggest, a kind of unconscious survival of the same feeling and practice, the real religious meaning being almost entirely lost. Lastly, I will venture to suggest that the xiii of the Roman custom made of branches at the Neptunalia and the feast of Anna Perenna and of the Verge by the slaves on the farm are a reminiscence of the earliest form of Italian dwelling, which survived in historical times in the round temple of Vesta, and of which we have examples in the hut urns discovered in the necropolis at Alba. The earliest form of awl was probably a round structure made of branches of trees stuck into the ground, bent inwards at the top, and tied together. Just as bronze instruments survived from an earlier stage of culture and some religious rites at Rome, so, I imagine, did this ancient form of dwelling, which really belongs to an age previous to that of permanent settlement and agricultural routine. The hut circles of the Neolithic age, such as are abundant on Dartmoor, were probably roofed with branches supported by a central pole. End of Appendix I. Appendix II of the Religious Experience of the Roman People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Religious Experience of the Roman People by W. Warde FOWLER. Professor Deubner's Theory of the Lupercalia. See pages 34 and 106. In the Archiv für Religionswissenschaft, 1910, page 481 following, Professor Deubner has published an interesting study of this puzzling festival, to which I wish to invite attention, though it has reached me too late for use in my earlier lectures. It has long been clear to me that any attempt to explain the details of the Lupercalia on a single hypothesis must be a failure. If all the details belong to the same age and the same original festival, we cannot recover the key to the whole ceremonial, though we may succeed in interpreting certain features of it with some success. Is it, however, possible that these details belong to different periods, that the whole rite, as we know it, with all the details put together from different sources of knowledge, was the result of an accretion of various features upon an original simple basis of ceremonial? Professor Deubner answers these questions in the affirmative and works out his answer with much skill and learning. He begins by explaining the word lupercus as derived from lupus and archeo, and meaning a keeper off of the wolves. The luperci were originally men chosen from two gentas, or families, to keep the wolves from the sheepfolds, in the days when the Palatine was a shepherd's settlement, and they did it by running round the base of the hill in a magical circle, if I understand him rightly. If that be so, we need not assume a deity lupercus, nor in fact any deity at all, nor need we see in the runners a quasi-dramatic representation of wolves as vegetation spirits, as Mannhardt proposed. See my Roman Festivals, page 316 following. This view has the advantage of making the rite a simple and practical one, such as would be natural to primitive Latins, and the etymology is apparently unexceptionable, though it will doubtless be criticized, as in fact it has been long ago. But in course of time, Professor Deubner goes on. There came to be engrafted on this simple rite of circumambulation, without reference to a deity, a festival of the rustic god Faunus, and now there was added a sacrifice of goats, which seem to have been his favorite victims, kids in Horace Odes 3:18. The luperci who had formerly run round the hill quite naked, as in many rites of the kind, see page 491, now girt themselves with the skins of the goats in order to increase their religious force in keeping away the wolves, with strength derived from the victims. But the luperci also carried in their hands, in the festival as we know it, strips of the skins of the victims with which they struck at women who offered themselves to the blows in order to make them fertile. This, Professor Deubner thinks, was a still later accretion. Life in a city had obliterated the original meaning of the rite, the keeping off wolves, but a new meaning becomes attached to it, presumably growing out of the use of the skins as magical instruments of additional force. Here, too, Juno first appears on the scene as the deity of women, for the strips were known as amicula in ononis, RF 321 and note. The strips may have been substituted for something carried in the hand to drive away the wolves. The goat, it should be noted, is prominent in the cult of Juno, e.g. at Lanuvium. The mystical meaning of striking or flogging has been sufficiently explained in this instance by Mannhardt, RF page 320, and is now familiar to anthropologists in other contexts. In the period when the fertilization of women became the leading feature of the rite, the state took up the popular festival, and it gained admittance to the religious calendar, which was drawn up for the city of the four regions. See above Lecture 4, page 106. The state was represented, as we learn from Ovid, by the Flamen Dialis, Fasti 2, page 282. But we still have to account for some strange detail which has never been satisfactorily explained in connection with the rest of the ceremony. The runners had their foreheads smeared with the blood of the victims, which was then wiped off with wool dipped in milk, after which, says Plutarch, Romulus 21, they were obliged to laugh. These details, as Professor Deubner remarks, seem very un-Roman. We have no parallel to them in Roman ritual, and I have remarked more than once in these lectures on the absence of the use of blood in Roman ceremonial. I have suggested that they were allowed to survive in the religion of the city-state, though actually belonging to that of a primitive population living on the site of Rome. Professor Deubner's explanation is very different and at first sight startling. These, he thinks, are Greek cathartic details added by Augustus when he reorganized the Lupercalia, as we may guess that he did from Suet Aug 31. They can all be paralleled from Greek religion. We know of them only from Plutarch, who quotes a certain Buddhist as writing Greek elegiacs, in which they were mentioned, but of the date of this poet we know nothing. Ovid does not mention these details, nor hint at them in the stories he tells about the festival. It is certainly possible that Augustus's revision may have been made after Ovid wrote the second book of the Fasti. It could not have been done until he became Pontificus Maximus in 12 BC, and perhaps not till long after that, and the Fasti was written sometime before Ovid's banishment in AD 9. That Augustus should insert Greek cathartic details in the old Roman festival is certainly surprising, but not impossible. We know that in the Ludi Seculares he took great pains to combine Greek with Roman ritual. The above is a mere outline of Professor Deubner's article, but enough, I hope, to attract the attention of English scholars to it. Whether or no it be accepted in whole or part by learned opinion, it will at least have the credit of suggesting a way in which not only the Lupercalia, but possibly other obscure rites may be compelled ultimately to yield up their secrets. End of Appendix II. Appendix III of the Religious Experience of the Roman People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Religious Experience of the Roman People by W. Warde FOWLER. The Pairs of Deities in Gellius 1323. The first paired deity mentioned by Gellius is Lua Saturni, also known as Lua Mater, of whom Dr. Fraser writes, page 412. In regard to Lua, we know that she was spoken of as a mother, which makes it not improbable that she was also a wife. We are not surprised to find him claiming this because Vesta is addressed as Mater in the Acta Frater Arv Henson, page 147. That virgin deity was also married. This he does in his lectures on kingship, page 222, quoting Ennius and Lactantius as making Vesta mother of Saturnus and Titan. No comment on this is needed for anyone conversant with Greco-Roman religion and literature from Ennius onward. The title Mater here means simply that Vesta was to her worshippers in a maternal position. Quam vis virginem indole tamen quadam materna praedidam vise nuper exposuit praenerus, says Henson, quoting Praener's Hestia Vesta, an old book but a good one, page 333. But to return to Lua, I freely confess that I cannot explain why she was styled Mater. We only know of her apart from the list in Gellius and one passage of Servius, from the two passages of Livy quoted without comment by Dr. Fraser. The first of these, 8:1, which may be taken from the pontifical books, seems to let in a ray of light on her nature and function. In 338 BC, the Volscians had been beaten, and Armorum Magna Vis was found in their camp. Ea luae matri sedare consul dixit, finesque postium usque ad maritamum oram depopulatus est. That is, as I understand the words, he dedicated the enemy's spoils to the Numan who was the enemy of his own crops. For if Lua be connected etymologically with Lues, she may be the hurtful aspect of Saturnus, like Tursa, Serphia, Serviae, Martiae, as Boucher explains it, Umbrica, page 98. A curious passage of Servius may be quoted in support of this view, in which Lue is an almost certain correction for Lunae. See Jordan's edition of Proyler's Rom Mythol, Volume 2, page 22. Commenting on Virgil's Arbori Bubsque Satisque Lues, Aeneid 3, 139. He writes, Quidam dicunt diversis numinibus vel bene vel male faciendi potestatum dicatum ut venere conjugia ceriare divortia. Iononi procreationem liberorum sterilitatem orum tam Saturno quam lue hanc eninum sicut Saturnum orbandi potestatem habere. Whatever Lua may originally have been, she seems to have been regarded as a power capable of working for evil in the crops and in women. If you could get her to work on your enemy's crop, CP the Excantatio above, page 58. So much the better, and the better would be her claim to the title of martyr. But Dr. Fraser supplies us with examples of a hostile spirit being called by a family name, e.g. grandfather smallpox, GB 3, page 98. When the consul had dedicated the spoils to her, he proceeded to assist her in her functions by ravaging the crops of the enemy. Thus she became later on a deity of spoils. In the Macedonian triumph of BC 167, we find her in company with Mars and Minerva as one of the deities to whom spolia hostium decare Ius fasce est. Livy 45:33. I may add here that Dr. Fraser has another arrow in his quiver to prove that Saturnus was married. If Lua was not his wife, which no Roman asserts, certainly, he says Ops was. He quotes a few words from Macrobius 1:13-19, in which these two are mentioned as husband and wife. If he had quoted the whole passage, his reader would have been better able to judge of the value of the writers of whom Macrobius says that they crederunt that Ops was wife of Saturn. For it appears that some of them fancied that Saturnus was a satu dictus quius causa de caelo est, a desperate attempt to make the old spirit of the seed into a heaven god, while Ops, whose name speaks for itself, was the earth. But the real companion deity to Ops was not Saturnus but Consus. This has been placed beyond reasonable doubt by Wisowa in his De Feris, reprinted in Gesammte Abhandlungen, page 154 following. See also my RF, page 212. The names Ops and Consus obviously refer to stored corn, and everything in their cult points the same way. Saturnus' connection with Ops is a late and a mistaken one, derived from the Grecian tendency which brought Kronos and Rhea to bear on them. Next, a word about Hora Kineri. This coupling of names is followed by Virites Kineri in the characteristic method explained in the text. CP Cicero Nat Deor 2:27 of Vesta, vis eius ad aras et focus pertinet. It is hardly necessary to comment on it. Hora is perhaps connected with Umbrian Harris, CP Bucheler Umbrica Index, which with kindred forms means willingness. Thus in Nerianum Mavoritis et Heram, Ennius frag 70 in Baron's fragment Poet Lat. We may see the strength in the will of Mars, CP Herii Ioninus. Hora is also connected in legend with Hersilia Ovid Met 14:829, and this helps to show how the Alexandrian erotic legend-making faculty got hold of her. But, says Dr. Fraser, Ennius regarded her as wife of Quirinus. Teke Quirine pater veneror haramque Quirini, fragment 71 of the Annales. This is Dr. Fraser's interpretation of the words, but Ennius says nothing of conjugal relations, and even if he had, his evidence as to the ancient Roman conceptions would be worthless. Ennius was not a Roman, he came from Magna Graecia, and if Dr. Fraser will read all that is said about him, e.g. in Schanz's History of Roman Literature, he will allow that every statement of such a man about old Roman ideas of the divine must be regarded with suspicion and subjected to careful criticism. Next, we come to Salacia Neptuni. Of this couple, Dr. Fraser says that Varro plainly implies that they were husband and wife, and that this is affirmed by Augustine, Seneca, and Servius. The accumulation of evidence seems strong, but Varro implies nothing of the kind, LLV 72. He is indulging in fancy etymologies and derives Neptunus from nubere, quod mare terras ob nubit et nubes celum ab nuptu. Id est opportune ut antiqui aqua nuptiae nuptus dictus. If he had meant to make Salacia wife of Neptunus, this last sentence would surely have suggested it, but he goes on after a full stop. Salacia Neptuni a Salo. It is only the later writers, ignorant of the real nature of Roman religious ideas, who make Salacia into a wife. It is worth noting that Varro adds another feminine deity in his next sentence. Venilia, whom Virgil makes the mother of Turnus, Aeneid 10:76, and Servius, commenting on this line, goes one better and says she was identical with Salacia. Perhaps both were sea or water spirits connected with Neptunus as famulae or anculae. See Wisowa RK, page 19. But they are lost to us, and speculation is useless. In RF, page 186, I suggested an explanation of Salacia, which I am disposed to withdraw. But for anyone wishing to study the treatment of old Roman noumena by the mythologists and philosophers of the Greco-Roman period, I would recommend an attentive reading of the whole chapter of Augustine from which Dr. Fraser quotes a few words. CD 722, and further a careful study of the Greco-Roman methods of fabricating myths about Roman divine names, for which he will do well to read the passages referred to by Wissowa in RK, page 250 and 251, and notes. Lastly comes Maya Volcani. Here for once we get a fact of cult, which is a relief after the loose and reckless statements of non-Roman and Christian writers. The Flamen Volcanalis sacrificed to Maya on May 1st, which proves that there was a real and not a fancied connection between Vulcanus and Maya, but certainly not that they were husband and wife. Dr. Fraser, however, quotes Cincius on the Fasti as App Macrobe 1, 12, 18, stating this and refers to Chances Gesch der Rom lit for information on him. In the second edition of that work, he will find a discussion of the very doubtful question as to whether the Cincius he quotes is the person whom he asserts him to be, viz., the annalist of the Second Punic War. The writer of the article, Cincius, in Pali Wissowa Real Encyclo, is very confident that the one who wrote on the Fasti lived as late as the age of Augustus. But putting that aside, what are we to make of the fact that another annalist, L. Calpurnius Piso, famous as the author of the first Lex de Repetundis, 149 BC, said that the wife of Vulcanus was not Maya, but Maestas. Piso was not a good authority. See above, page 51. But he seems here to bring the consort of the fire god into line with such expressions of activity as moles, virites, and so on. And it seems that as early as the 2nd century BC, sport and speculation with these names were beginning. I have quoted the whole pedantic passage from Macrobius in my Roman Festivals, page 98, where the reader may enjoy it at leisure. I shall not be surprised if he comes to the conclusion that neither Macrobius nor his learned informers knew anything about Maya. When he reads that she was the mother of Mercurius, he will recollect that Mercurius was not a Roman deity of the earliest period, and did not belong to the Dei Indigetes. And when he finds that she is identified with Bona Dea, he must not forget that the deity, as scholars are now pretty well agreed, was introduced at Rome from Tarentum in the age of the Punic Wars. The one fact we know is the sacrifice by the Flamen Volcanalis on May 1. Someone went to work to explain this in another, viz. That the Ides of the month was the dedication day of the first temple of Mercurius, BC 495, and also the fact that the temple of the Bona Dea on the Aventine was dedicated on the calends. The result was an extraordinary jumble of fancy and myth, which has been recognized as such by those who have studied closely the methods of Greco-Roman scholarship. The unwary, of course, are taken in. A student of these methods might do well to take as an exercise in criticism the 3 specimens of Roman mythology, which Dr. Fraser says, page 413, have survived the wreck of antiquity: the loves of Vertumnus and Pomona, of Jupiter and Juturna, of Janus and Cardea. In the last of these especially, he will find one of the most audacious pieces of charming and willful invention that a Latin poet could perpetrate, in imitation of Hellenistic love tales, and to suit the taste of a public whose education was mainly Greek. The above lengthy note was written before I had seen von Domaszewski's paper on this subject, Festre für O. Hirschfeld, reprinted in Abhandlungen zur Rom-Religion, page 104 following, CP page 162. His explanations are different in detail from mine, but rest on the same general principle that the names Salacia, etc., indicate functions or attributes of the male deity to whom they are attached. End of Appendix IV. Appendix IV of the Religious Experience of the Roman People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Religious Experience of the Roman People by W. Warde FOWLER. Ius and Fas. In historical times, the 2 kinds of ius, divinum and humanum, were strongly distinguished. See Wissowa RK, page 318, who quotes Gaius 2:2. Summa itaque rerum divisio in duos articulos deducitur, nam algia sunt divini iuris, algia humani. But it is almost certain that there was originally no such clear distinction. The general opinion of historians of Roman law is thus expressed by Cook, Institutions juridiques des Romains, page 54. Le droit civil n'a eu d'abord qu'une portée fort restreinte. Peu à peu, il a gagné du terrain. Il a entrepris de réglementer des rapports qui autrefois étaient du domaine de la religion, pendant longtemps à Rome le droit théocratique a coexisté avec le droit civil. See also Muirhead, Introduction to Roman Law, editor Gowdy, page 15. Possibly the formation of an organized calendar marking off the days belonging to the deities from those which were not so made over to them first gave the opportunity for the gradual realization of the thought that the set of rules under which the citizen was responsible to the divine beings was not exactly the same as that under which he was responsible to the civil authorities. The distinction took many ages to realize in all its aspects, and is not complete even under the 12 tables or later, because the sanction for civil offenses remained in great part a divine one. On this point, Gering is certainly wrong. Geist des Rome Rechts 1, 267 following. As Cook remarks, page 54, note 1, one institution of the Ius Divinum kept its force after the complete secularization of law and retains it to this day, viz. The oath. If there was originally no distinction between religious and civil rules of law, it follows that there were originally no two distinguishing terms for them. The earliest passage in which they are distinguished is Ius Divinum and Humanum, as far as I know, is Cicero's speech for Cestius, BC 56, section 91, quoted by Wisowa, page 319. Domicilia coniuncta quas urbes dicimus, invento et divino iure et humano, moenibus cincerunt. But by all British writers on Roman law, and by many foreign ones, the word fas is used as equivalent to the ius divinum and sharply distinguished from ius. Thus the late Dr. Greenidge, in his useful work on Roman public life, page 52 and elsewhere, makes this distinction. He writes of the rex as the chief expounder of the divine law, fas, and of the control exercised by fas over the civilian's life. C.P. Muirhead, editor Gowdy, page 15 following, where Mommsen is quoted thus. Mommsen is probably near the mark when he describes legis regae as mostly rules of the fas, but Mommsen, like Wisowa in his Religion und Cultus, does not use the word fas, but speaks of sacral recht. Zohm, on the other hand, Roman law translated by Ledley, page 15, note, compares fas with Sanskrit dharma and Greek themis as meaning unwritten rules of divine origin, which eventually gave way before ius, as in Greece before dikeon, C.P. Binder, De Plebs, page 501. But it is safer in this case to leave etymology alone and to try to discover what the Romans themselves understood by fas, which is indeed a peculiar and puzzling word. For its possible connection with fari, effari, agera fatus, faunum and profanum, etc. see H. Nettleship's contributions to Latin lexicography, SV fas. Fas was at all times indeclinable and is rarely found even as an accusative, as in Virgil Aeneid 9:96. Mortaline manu facte immortale carine, fas habeant. In the oldest example of its use, i.e. in the ancient calendar QRCF on March 24 and May 24, i.e. quando rex comitiavit fas, Varro LL 631, and QSTDF on June 15th, i.e. quando stercus dilatum fas, Varro LL 632. It is hard to say whether it is a substantive at all and not rather an adverb like satis. So too in the antique language of the Lex Templi of Furfo, 58 BC, we read, Uti tangere satira tegere de quaera deficere mandare ferro oiti promovere referre fasce esto. Liceat should probably be inserted before fasce esto. See CIL 1-603, line 7, Dessau, inscript lat selecte 2-1, 49 and 06, page 246. In these examples, fas simply means that you may do certain acts without breaking religious law. It does not stand for the religious law itself. To me, it looks like a technical word of the ius divinum, meaning that which it is lawful to do under it. Thus, ad dies fastus is one on which it is lawful under that ius to perform certain acts of civil government. Sine diaculo, Varro LL 629. Nefas is therefore in the same way a word which conveys a prohibition under the divine law. By constant juxtaposition with ius, fas came in course of time to take on the character of a substantive, and so too did its opposite nefas. The dictionaries supply many examples of its use as a substantive and is paralleled with ius, but the only one I can find that is earlier than Cicero is Terence Ellaqyint 327, i.e. in the work of a non-Roman. I cannot find that it is so used by Varro, where we might naturally have expected it. Cicero does not call his imaginary ius divinum a fas, but iura religionum constitutio religionum legibus 2, 10-23 and 17-32. Ius is the word always used technically of particular departments of the religious law, e.g. Ius und Officium, Ius augurale, and Ius fetiale. CIL 1, page 202 is Premius Ius fetiale paravit. The notion that fas could mean a kind of code of religious law is probably due to Virgil's use of the word in Quipe etiam festus quadam exercere Deubus fas et ira sinunt, George 1, 269, and to the comment of Servius, id est divina humanaque iora permittunt, nam ad religionem fas ad homines iora pertinent. It is strange to find it personified as a kind of deity in the formula of the fetiales, used when they announced the Roman demands at an enemy's frontier, Livy 1:32. Audi iupeter inquit audite fines, huius conque gentus, sunt nominat, adiat fas. Whence did Livy get this formula? We have no record of a book of the fetiales. If this came from those of the pontifexes, as is probable, the formula need not be of an ancient date, and the personification of fines also suggests a doubt as to the genuineness of the whole formula. End of Appendix IV. Appendix V of the Religious Experience of the Roman People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Religious Experience of the Roman People by W. Warde FOWLER. The Worship of Sacred Utensils. There can be no doubt that some kind of worship was paid by the Arvel brethren to certain mleigh, or primitive vessels of sun-baked clay used in their most ancient rites. This is attested by two inscriptions of different ages, which are printed on pages 26 and 27 of Henson's Acta Fratrum Aurelium. After leaving their grove and entering the temple in mensa sacrum fecerunt ovis, and shortly afterwards in edem introverunt et olas precatis sunt. Then, to our astonishment, we read that the door of the temple was opened and the mleigh thrown down the slope in front of it. This last act seems inexplicable, but the worship finds a singular parallel in the dairy ritual of the Todas of the Nilgiri Hills. Dr. Rivers, in his work on the Todas, Macmillan 1906, page 453, in summing up his impressions of their worship, observes that the attitude of worship, which is undoubtedly present in the Toda mind, is becoming transferred from the gods themselves to the material objects used in the service of the gods. The religious attitude of worship is being transferred from the gods themselves to the objects around which centers the ritual of the dairy. These objects are mainly the bells of the buffaloes and the dairy vessels, and an explicit account of them, the reverence in which they are held, and the prayers in which they are mentioned will be found in the 5th, 6th, and 8th chapters of Dr. Rivers' work, which, as an account of what seems to be a religion atrophied by overdevelopment of ritual, is in many ways of great interest to the student of Roman religious experience. The following sentence will appeal to the readers of these lectures. The Todas seem to show us how the overdevelopment of the ritual aspect of religion may lead to atrophy of those ideas and beliefs through which the religion has been built up, and then how, in its turn, the ritual may suffer, and acts which are performed mechanically, with no living ideas behind them, may come to be performed carelessly and incompletely, while religious observances which involve trouble and discomfort may be evaded or completely neglected. Whether the worship of the mleigh was a part of the original ritual of the brethren, or grew up after its revival by Augustus, it is impossible to determine. But if we can allow the dairy ritual of the Todas to help us in the matter, we may conclude that in any case it was not really primitive, and that it was a result of that process of over-ritualization to which must also be ascribed the piacula caused by the growth of a fig tree on the roof of the temple, and the 3 Sondergurte adolenda comolenda deferunda. See above, page 161, Vol and Henson Acta Fratra Arv, page 147. End of Appendix